The end of World War I did not bring relief to Germany, it brought despair. Streets once filled with the cheer of families and the energy of industry were now silent, punctuated only by the cries of hunger and the groans of soldiers returning from battle, many broken in body or spirit. The nation was defeated, not just militarily but psychologically. Its people felt humiliated, abandoned, and betrayed. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, compounded this anguish. Germany was forced to accept full blame for the war, pay massive reparations, and surrender large portions of its territory. The restrictions on its army and industry created widespread frustration. People felt they were paying for a war they did not start, and resentment seeped into every corner of German life. The economic situation was dire. Hyperinflation wiped out savings, middle-class families lost their life's work overnight, and unemployment surged. For young Germans, particularly students, the future appeared bleak. Universities and schools struggled to operate as funds dried up and teachers faced uncertainty. Youth saw no clear path forward, and many were drawn to radical ideas that promised hope, power, and meaning. They wanted purpose, identity, and a sense that their lives mattered, something the struggling republic could not provide. In this environment, Adolf Hitler emerged as a figure who seemed to offer answers. A skilled orator with a talent for reading emotions, Hitler spoke directly to the fears and frustrations of the people. He framed Germany's suffering as the result of betrayal from within and oppression from outside. He blamed minorities, communists, and other enemies for the nation's decline, while promising to restore Germany to its former glory. For the youth, whose lives were shaped by scarcity and disillusionment, Hitler's messages were magnetic. He appeared as a guide, offering strength, pride, and belonging in a world that seemed chaotic and unfair. Young Germans became the focus of Hitler's attention because he understood that controlling the next generation meant securing the future of his ideology. He spoke of the youth as the builders of the new Germany, strong, disciplined, and devoted to the state. In contrast to the adults who were skeptical or weary, the youth were energetic, impressionable, and eager to find purpose. Hitler's charisma, combined with his promises of a powerful, proud nation, drew many teenagers toward him. They were offered not just a political vision, but a lifestyle filled with order, recognition, and a sense of importance. Education became a primary tool for shaping young minds. Textbooks were rewritten to emphasize German heroism and victimhood, while history lessons blamed certain groups for the nation's problems. Students were taught to value loyalty, obedience, and national pride above all else. Critical thinking was discouraged, replaced by repetition of state-approved ideas. Teachers were monitored to ensure alignment with Nazi principles, and students were encouraged to report peers or family members who expressed dissent. This pervasive surveillance created an environment where young people internalized the ideology, often without fully understanding its broader consequences. By 1933, when Hitler became Chancellor, the process of shaping youth accelerated. The Nazi regime swiftly dismantled democratic institutions and took control of public life. Newspapers, radios, and even cinema became tools of propaganda. In towns and cities across Germany, children and teenagers were surrounded by the symbols and messages of the state. Flags, marches, rallies, and slogans dominated daily life, reinforcing the idea that loyalty to Hitler and the nation was paramount. For a generation growing up in instability, this constant messaging created a sense of security and purpose even if it came at the cost of independent thought. Hitler's appeal to youth was not only political but psychological. He offered belonging, recognition, and the promise of adventure. Physical training, marching, uniforms, and collective activities made adolescents feel part of something larger than themselves. For the first time in their lives, many experienced a sense of structure, discipline, and mission. They were no longer ordinary students struggling in an unstable society, they were becoming the architects of a new Germany. Yet beneath this outward appearance of opportunity lay manipulation. Young people were being conditioned to equate loyalty with morality and obedience with heroism, leaving little room for doubt or personal reflection. The emotional manipulation extended beyond schools into homes. Parents who questioned Nazi policies risked social exclusion or worse, while children were encouraged to report disloyalty. Families often experienced tension and fear, as children sometimes became instruments of the state. In this way, the Nazi regime infiltrated not only public spaces but private ones, ensuring that youth were constantly immersed in its ideology. The shaping of a generation was not left to chance, it was a calculated and deliberate effort that targeted their hopes, fears, and identities. By the mid-1930s, Germany's surface-level stability appeared remarkable. Unemployment fell, infrastructure projects created visible progress, and national pride was celebrated publicly. For young people, this environment felt safe, organized, and meaningful. Uniforms, organized activities, and public recognition created a sense of inclusion and status. Adolescents who once felt powerless now felt central to the life of the nation. The state, in return, gained absolute loyalty. Yet the cost was the erosion of individuality and critical thinking, a generation being prepared to serve a cause without fully questioning its morality or consequences. This early period of Nazi Germany shows that the rise of Hitler was not merely political but deeply psychological. The youth were not just passive observers, they were active participants in a cultural transformation that intertwined hope with control. Hitler did not merely seize power through legislation or force, he captured hearts and minds, using charisma, propaganda, and promises of belonging to shape an entire generation. Children and teenagers, who should have been guided to think freely and independently, were instead molded into instruments of the state's vision. Understanding this context is crucial to comprehending the role of youth in the years that followed. Before the battlefields of World War II and the horrors that unfolded, there was this quieter, more insidious battle for the minds of young people. It was a battle fought in classrooms, homes, streets, and camps, a battle where the prize was their loyalty, identity, and future. The foundation for the involvement of Hitler youth and student participation in the Nazi regime was laid during these early, turbulent years. The manipulation of hopes, fears, and aspirations created a generation ready to follow without question, a generation whose lives would soon be consumed by war and ideology. As the 1930s progressed, Germany under Hitler transformed at an astonishing pace. Beyond the visible changes in streets, factories, and public offices, a subtler, yet profoundly powerful transformation was taking place, the shaping of the nation's youth. Recognizing that the future of the Nazi regime depended on the loyalty of young Germans, Hitler and his party created organizations, programs, and social structures specifically designed to capture the minds and hearts of children and teenagers. Among these, the most significant was the Hitler Youth, or Hitlerjugend, which became the primary instrument for preparing a generation to embrace and enact Nazi ideology. The creation of the Hitler Youth was not merely an extracurricular activity or a voluntary club. From the early 1930s, it evolved into a highly structured organization that combined physical training, ideological education, and social indoctrination. Boys aged 14 to 18 were the main participants, while younger children were often enrolled in the Pimpfei, Little Fellows, an introductory wing that introduced them to basic discipline and Nazi values. Girls, too, had a parallel organization called the League of German Girls, where the focus was on domestic skills, physical fitness, and preparation for motherhood in line with the regime's vision of gender roles. Together, these organizations ensured that nearly all German youth were touched by the state's influence in some form. Participation in Hitler Youth became increasingly compulsory after 1936. While early membership may have appeared voluntary, by law all eligible youth were required to join. This compulsory membership ensured that children and teenagers, regardless of personal or family beliefs, were immersed in Nazi activities. School curricula were closely linked with youth programs, creating an environment where ideology was constantly reinforced. History lessons glorified Germany's past, particularly military victories, while painting other nations and certain groups as enemies. Biology and science classes were infused with racial theories, promoting ideas of Aryan superiority. Even literature and arts emphasized nationalism, discipline, and obedience. The boundary between education and indoctrination became nearly invisible. The daily life of a Hitler Youth member was a mix of physical exertion, group activities, and ideological instruction. Mornings could begin with marches and drills, followed by hours of reading Nazi texts or participating in discussions that reinforced loyalty to the Führer. Physical fitness was heavily emphasized. Strength, endurance, and discipline were seen not merely as health benefits but as moral virtues. Camping trips, sports competitions, and military-style exercises were designed to foster teamwork, courage, and a sense of belonging. Adolescents were trained to value collective identity over personal desires, internalizing the idea that their individual actions must serve the greater goals of the nation. Indoctrination was not limited to formal lessons or physical training. Nazi propaganda permeated every aspect of youth culture. Posters depicting heroic soldiers, idealized Aryan families, and symbols of the swastika were everywhere in classrooms, public squares, and youth camps. Radio broadcasts and films were carefully produced to capture attention and convey messages of obedience, racial purity, and national pride. Leaders of the Hitler Youth used these tools to reinforce their authority, making the organization appear not only educational but exciting and prestigious. For many teenagers, participation became a source of status. Wearing the uniform, attending rallies, and performing well in competitions gave a tangible sense of recognition and importance. The psychological impact of this constant immersion in ideology was profound. Young people were taught to view the world in simple binaries: friends and enemies, loyalty and betrayal, strength and weakness. Critical thinking was discouraged. Questioning orders or challenging the party's teachings was framed as moral failure or treachery. Peer pressure reinforced conformity, as members who resisted or hesitated could be ostracized or reported. Many students internalized the idea that obedience and loyalty were not only expected but virtuous, forming a mindset that would later enable them to participate in war and other state-directed activities with little hesitation. Parents often found themselves in difficult positions. Some silently supported the Nazi emphasis on discipline and education, hoping it would provide their children with stability and opportunity. Others were skeptical but afraid to voice opposition. Children who were enthusiastic members of Hitler Youth sometimes acted as intermediaries of the regime within their families, reporting disobedience or questioning parents' attitudes toward the state. This created tension and reinforced the notion that the state's authority extended into the private sphere, even within households. By the late 1930s, the Nazi regime's strategy for youth was fully operational. Students were no longer simply learning academic subjects, they were being molded into citizens whose identity, behavior, and ambitions were aligned with the state. Loyalty to Hitler was presented as a moral duty, and participation in the collective life of the Hitler Youth became a central measure of a young person's character. The ideological education was complemented by practical skills that would later serve military and wartime purposes, including basic weapon training, survival skills, and teamwork exercises. This period also revealed the effectiveness of combining structure with social rewards. Adolescents were drawn to the sense of belonging, recognition, and prestige offered by Hitler Youth. Many genuinely believed they were contributing to the rebirth of Germany, unaware that their education and activities were designed to prepare them for war and to normalize the regime's oppressive and violent policies. The line between personal enthusiasm and state manipulation blurred, making it increasingly difficult for individuals to resist the influence of the organization. In understanding the formation of Hitler Youth and the indoctrination of students, it becomes clear that Hitler's rise to power was not only a political conquest but also a cultural and psychological one. By shaping the values, behavior, and identities of an entire generation, the Nazi regime ensured that its ideology would not simply survive but thrive in the minds of the young. The combination of physical training, ideological instruction, peer pressure, and social recognition created a generation of adolescents who were prepared to serve the state unquestioningly. Chapter 2, therefore, illustrates the deep entrenchment of Nazi influence in youth culture. Schools, families, and social organizations became conduits for ideology, shaping perceptions, morals, and ambitions. Hitler Youth was not merely an organization, it was a system designed to capture both the energy and the loyalty of a generation. It created young Germans who equated personal worth with service to the state and who internalized the values and prejudices of the Nazi regime. The stage was now set for the next phase. These indoctrinated youth would soon be called upon to play an active role in the unfolding drama of war, their minds already aligned with the goals of the state. When World War II erupted in 1939, the German youth, long molded by years of indoctrination, found themselves stepping into roles that would blur the lines between childhood, adolescence, and militarized adulthood. For many teenagers, life no longer revolved around school or leisure, it revolved around the war effort, the state, and loyalty to Adolf Hitler. What had begun as a carefully structured program of education, discipline, and ideology through the Hitler Youth now transformed into active participation in one of history's most devastating conflicts. The organization that had trained, motivated, and manipulated Germany's young people had prepared them to face not only physical challenges but also moral dilemmas that would leave lasting scars. The role of Hitler Youth during the war was multifaceted. Initially, many adolescents were mobilized to assist in non-combat tasks such as delivering messages, assisting in factories, or helping with agricultural work to support the war economy. Boys learned to navigate logistics, maintain equipment, and organize local communities to ensure that resources were efficiently allocated to the military. These seemingly simple responsibilities were more than chores, they instilled a sense of importance and contribution, reinforcing the idea that their actions were vital to the nation. For teenagers who had grown up seeking purpose and recognition, these duties provided both status and identity. As the war progressed and casualties mounted, the roles of Hitler Youth members shifted dramatically. By the later years of the conflict, some teenagers were directly recruited into military service. Boys as young as 16 were trained in weapons handling, infantry tactics, and basic combat skills. The organization's earlier emphasis on physical training and discipline paid off, producing adolescents who were surprisingly capable of following military orders with precision. While they lacked the experience of older soldiers, their loyalty and willingness to obey made them formidable in certain situations. In many cases, Hitler Youth members were assigned to support frontline units, acting as messengers, scouts, and assistants. In desperate situations, they were even called upon to fight directly. Girls, while not sent to combat, played critical roles in sustaining the war effort. Members of the League of German Girls were often involved in nursing, civil defense, and organizing local communities. They were trained in first aid, emergency response, and home front management. Their activities reinforced the Nazi ideals of service, sacrifice, and duty, demonstrating that every member of the youth, regardless of gender, had a role to play in the nation's survival and the war's success. These efforts were framed as heroic, contributing to the broader perception that every adolescent's actions were meaningful in the fight for Germany. The psychological impact of this wartime participation was profound. Teenagers who had spent years in indoctrination were now placed in situations where obedience, courage, and loyalty were constantly tested. The state's propaganda had prepared them to see the war as a moral crusade, framing enemies in simple terms and glorifying sacrifice for the nation. Peer pressure and communal reinforcement strengthened this mindset, creating an environment where fear of shame or disloyalty was as powerful as fear of physical danger. Adolescents were expected to uphold Nazi values even in the chaos of war, often suppressing doubt, fear, or ethical questioning. Schools and educational institutions were further transformed during the war. Traditional academic subjects were often de-emphasized in favor of military training, technical skills, and ideological reinforcement. Textbooks were updated to include lessons on heroism, national sacrifice, and the necessity of victory at all costs. Students' accomplishments in the Hitler Youth became the primary measure of their value and recognition, creating a culture in which personal achievement was inseparable from service to the state. For many young Germans, the classroom became indistinguishable from a preparatory ground for war. One of the most disturbing aspects of youth involvement was the normalization of extreme loyalty and obedience. Adolescents were encouraged, and sometimes compelled, to report disloyalty or resistance, even within their families. Friendships and social bonds were framed in terms of ideological alignment rather than personal connection. Children and teenagers were taught to place loyalty to the state above all else, including morality or empathy. In this way, the Nazi regime created a generation whose ethical compass was heavily distorted, guided primarily by the directives of a totalitarian state rather than independent reasoning or conscience. Despite the severe pressures, many adolescents experienced a sense of purpose and identity in these roles. The routines of Hitler Youth, combined with the excitement of participating in a war they had been conditioned to see as just, offered structure in a world that had long felt uncertain. Physical training, camaraderie, and recognition for contributions created a feeling of achievement. However, this sense of pride was inseparable from the manipulation and moral compromise that underpinned it. The war forced young Germans to act within systems of violence and oppression, often without the ability to question or refuse participation. Families continued to experience tension as youth increasingly operated as extensions of the state. In some households, parents silently watched as their children embraced roles in support of the war, unsure whether to intervene. In others, ideological loyalty created rifts, with children reporting or condemning family members perceived as unsupportive. The intimate intrusion of the state into family life reinforced the omnipresence of Nazi authority and emphasized the centrality of youth participation in sustaining the regime. By the final years of the war, Hitler Youth members were facing dire circumstances. Germany's defeat became increasingly apparent, resources were scarce, and the consequences of years of indoctrination became starkly visible. Many adolescents were thrust into combat roles without adequate preparation, facing life-threatening situations that demanded rapid adaptation and unwavering loyalty. The psychological and emotional toll was immense. Young people who had been celebrated for their dedication were now exposed to fear, trauma, and the brutal realities of war. Yet, the indoctrination they had received left them committed to the ideals of the regime, even as it crumbled around them. The experiences of Hitler Youth during World War II illustrate how education, ideology, and social organization can converge to shape the behavior of an entire generation. From non-combat duties to active military participation, young Germans were both actors and victims within the machinery of the Nazi state. Their identities, molded over years of indoctrination, made them both willing and capable participants in a conflict that demanded extreme obedience and sacrifice. While some teenagers may have recognized the moral implications of their actions, the pervasive influence of propaganda, peer pressure, and institutionalized authority often suppressed dissent or ethical questioning. Chapter 3 demonstrates the tragic consequences of the early indoctrination of youth. Adolescents who had once sought purpose and identity found themselves entangled in a war that tested every aspect of their moral and emotional resilience. The combination of ideology, physical training, and communal reinforcement had produced a generation capable of both extraordinary obedience and remarkable endurance, yet vulnerable to manipulation and moral compromise. As Germany faced defeat and devastation, the role of Hitler Youth revealed how the shaping of young minds could translate into active participation in war, illustrating the profound power and danger of targeting youth as instruments of the state. By 1945, the world that Germany had known for decades was unrecognizable. The war had devastated cities, destroyed infrastructure, and claimed the lives of millions, including soldiers, civilians, and countless members of the Hitler Youth who had been sent to the front lines. For the generation that had grown up under Hitler's influence, the collapse of Nazi Germany was both a political defeat and a profound personal upheaval. The promises of pride, identity, and purpose that had once drawn them so eagerly into the regime now lay in ruins. Yet the consequences were deeper than physical destruction. They reached into the minds, emotions, and moral frameworks of a generation that had been shaped to serve a destructive ideology without question. As Allied forces advanced from the west and Soviet troops from the east, the certainty that had been instilled in German youth began to crumble. Cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden were reduced to rubble, and the structures of the Nazi state schools, youth organizations, and administrative offices ceased to function. Adolescents who had been trained to obey without hesitation were suddenly left without guidance or purpose. Many who had been active participants in the war, either in combat or support roles, faced the harsh reality that the ideals they had been taught were false. The pride and heroism they had associated with service now appeared as manipulation and tragedy. The psychological and emotional impact on young Germans was immense. Teenagers who had once felt a sense of belonging and identity through the Hitler Youth now struggled with guilt, confusion, and disillusionment. Those who had reported disloyalty within their families, who had taken part in enforcing Nazi policies, or who had fought on the front lines were forced to confront the consequences of their actions. The very traits that had been celebrated, obedience, loyalty, and unquestioning dedication, suddenly became sources of shame and regret. For many, the transition from indoctrinated adolescent to survivor of a destroyed nation was painful and disorienting. Education, which had once been a tool of indoctrination, became a tool of reconstruction. Schools reopened under new authorities, and curricula were rewritten to emphasize critical thinking, history from multiple perspectives, and moral reasoning. Teachers were retrained to help students process the experiences of war and propaganda, often addressing trauma, loss, and ethical questions that had been ignored during the Nazi years. The challenge was immense. A generation that had spent formative years in a system designed to suppress independent thought now had to relearn how to evaluate information, question authority, and make ethical decisions on their own. The collapse of Nazi Germany also revealed the long-term social consequences of manipulating youth. Many young people had missed out on normal adolescence. Instead of exploring ideas, building friendships, or pursuing personal interests, they had been immersed in political activity, military training, and ideological reinforcement. The result was a generation that, while disciplined and resilient, had suffered emotionally, morally, and psychologically. Recovering from these years required not only physical reconstruction but also profound social and emotional rehabilitation, as families, schools, and communities worked to help adolescents reclaim their identities and rebuild trust in themselves and others. The lessons of Hitler Youth extend beyond the historical context of Nazi Germany. They highlight the extreme vulnerability of young people to manipulation, particularly in times of social, economic, or political instability. Adolescents, searching for meaning, recognition, and belonging, can be drawn into systems that exploit these desires for harmful purposes. The story of Hitler Youth demonstrates the power of ideology, propaganda, and structured organizations in shaping the behavior, values, and loyalty of an entire generation. It also underscores the importance of critical thinking, moral education, and independent judgment in protecting young people from exploitation. Families and communities were forced to confront uncomfortable truths as the war ended. Parents who had been cautious or skeptical during the Nazi years now faced the challenge of reconciling their children's actions with ethical responsibility. Adolescents themselves struggled to understand the disparity between what they had been taught and the reality of the world around them. The post-war years became a period of reflection, education, and rebuilding, both in practical terms and in the moral and psychological domains. Young Germans were learning, often painfully, how to reclaim personal agency and reconstruct values that had been distorted by years of indoctrination. The end of World War II also marked the dismantling of the organizations that had controlled youth. Hitler Youth, once a central pillar of the Nazi regime, was officially disbanded, and its leaders faced prosecution or punishment. Yet the experiences of the members left a lasting mark. Some went on to contribute positively to the rebuilding of Germany, while others carried scars, emotional, ethical, and social, that would influence their entire lives. The dual reality of resilience and trauma among this generation demonstrates both the adaptability of youth and the dangers of early manipulation. In broader terms, the collapse of Nazi Germany and the experiences of its youth provide a cautionary tale for all societies. When fear, economic hardship, and social instability converge, adolescents are especially susceptible to messages that promise purpose, identity, and belonging. If these messages are tied to extremist ideology, they can lead to profound moral and social consequences. The story of Hitler Youth emphasizes that protecting young minds requires not only education and guidance but also an environment in which questioning, empathy, and independent thought are encouraged. As Germany began to recover, the lessons of these years were integrated into both education and public memory. Schools taught about the dangers of totalitarianism, propaganda, and blind obedience. Families and communities worked to encourage critical thinking, social responsibility, and ethical reasoning. Young people, once tools of the state, gradually reclaimed their identities as independent citizens, capable of reflection, choice, and moral action. While the scars of indoctrination could never be fully erased, the post-war efforts demonstrated the potential for resilience, learning, and moral recovery. In conclusion, the collapse of Nazi Germany and the experiences of Hitler Youth reveal a complex interplay of power, ideology, and human vulnerability. A generation shaped to serve a destructive regime found itself confronting the consequences of manipulation, obedience, and moral compromise. The aftermath emphasized both the dangers of indoctrination and the remarkable capacity of young people to recover and rebuild. Today, the story of Hitler Youth stands as a warning and a lesson. When the minds of youth are targeted, the consequences extend far beyond politics and war, shaping societies, moral frameworks, and the very fabric of the next generation. The history of these years reminds us that education, critical thinking, and ethical guidance are essential tools in safeguarding the future, ensuring that no generation is ever again molded to serve oppression instead of humanity.